He sold 250 million records. He was knighted by the Queen. He outlasted every trend, every rival, every era of British pop music. And yet at 85 years old, Cliff Richard sometimes leaves the lights on at night just to soften the silence of an empty house. That is not the story the world was told. For more than 6 decades, audiences saw the smile, the discipline, the unbreakable energy of a man who seemed to exist beyond the reach of ordinary pain. But underneath that polished surface, something far more complicated was quietly accumulating. Grief he never processed, loneliness he never admitted, and truths he carried alone for decades. What follows is a story about what fame extracts from a human being over the course of a lifetime, and what remains when the applause finally fades. Harry Roger Webb arrived in the world on the 14th of October, 1940, in Lucknow, then part of British India. His father, Roger Oscar Webb, managed catering services for the Indian Railways, and his mother, Dorothy Marie Dasley, came from an Anglo-Indian family that understood hard work far better than it understood comfort. When the violence of Direct Action Day tore through the subcontinent, the Webb family packed what they could carry and left for Britain, arriving with modest means and enormous hope, settling into the kind of ordinary life that offers no guarantees but demands everything you have. As a teenager navigating an unfamiliar England, Harry discovered music with the intensity that only adolescents can truly feel, and at 16 his father bought him a guitar. It was a small gesture, but this one quietly redirected the trajectory of a life. Harry formed a vocal group called the Quintones in 1957, then joined the Dick Teague Skiffle Group, learning by doing what no classroom could have taught him. His father died before he could witness where that guitar eventually led, and Cliff carried that absence into every stadium, every record, every ovation that followed. The crowd could fill a room, but it could never fill that particular silence. With his father gone, the weight of the family landed directly on Cliff's young shoulders, and he became the provider for his mother and 3 younger sisters almost overnight. The discipline, the clean-cut image, the refusal to collapse publicly, what read to audiences as effortless confidence was, in large part, the posture of a young man who had learned very early that falling apart simply was not an option. He held it together because there was nobody else to hold it together, and he held it so long that eventually the holding became indistinguishable from the person himself. Then, just as the decades of fame were beginning to slow, a different kind of grief moved in. His mother received a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and for more than 10 years, Cliff watched her memory dismantle itself piece by piece until he would sit beside a woman who no longer recognized the face of the son she had raised. By the time she passed in 2007, he had already been mourning her for years, the kind of loss that arrives gradually, over and over again, without any single definitive moment to grieve. Then in 2016, his sister Donna died suddenly, just weeks after the most devastating legal ordeal of his life had finally been resolved. Donna had been his anchor through that nightmare, and losing her felt like the floor giving way a second time within the same breath. Bachelor Boy landed in the early 1960s as a cheerful throwaway pop song about a young man enjoying his freedom before settling down, and nobody read anything significant into it at the time. That changed as the years accumulated, and Cliff remained unmarried because that lyric slowly transformed into a question the public never stopped asking, dressed in different clothes across different decades, but always pointing at the same thing: why no wife? Why no children? Why always alone? No clean answer ever came because there was never a clean answer to give. In his autobiography, My Life, My Way, Cliff wrote honestly about the near impossibility of sustaining any real relationship beneath the weight of constant touring and relentless public attention, describing deep love and genuine connection throughout his life, while acknowledging that the kind of commitment marriage demands is almost incompatible with the kind of life he was living. Trust, the quiet foundation of any lasting relationship, became something he could never fully build because privacy, which is what trust requires to breathe, was the one thing fame never allowed him. His most publicized romance was with tennis champion Sue Barker in the 1980s, and the media treated it like a fairy tale. Cliff later admitted he had come genuinely close to proposing, but stepped back after recognizing he didn't feel strongly enough to offer a commitment that deserved everything. it wouldn't have been fair to either of them. His own words, unglamorized and utterly decent, revealing more about his character than any headline managed to. Through much of those years, one steady presence held his private world together. Bill Latham, his close friend and former manager, shared a home with Cliff in Sunningdale for more than 30 years, alongside Bill's mother and, later, Cliff's own mother, during the years of her illness. Their living arrangement attracted considerable speculation, and Cliff addressed it consistently. Bill was family, not in the way tabloids imagined, but in the way that actually matters. Someone who knows you completely, who understands the gap between the public version of you and the actual one, and who stays anyway. When Bill passed away in 2022, Cliff grieved in a way he rarely had before, because the man who had quietly anchored his world for 30 years was gone, and what remained was a stillness that no tour, no album, and no ovation could touch. The summer of 2014 arrived without warning. Cliff was on holiday in Portugal when his Berkshire home was raided by police, while television cameras broadcast live footage of officers carrying boxes out of his front door, and he was not there, had not been arrested, had not been charged with anything. The images circled the globe before a single fact had been properly established. An anonymous allegation of historic sexual abuse had triggered a media spectacle of a scale that seemed designed to destroy. And it worked, at least partly, because an accusation arrives instantly and permanently, while the truth moves slowly and quietly, the way truth usually does. For nearly 2 years, Cliff lived inside that cloud, and the word he eventually chose to describe the experience was contaminated. Not angry, not defiant, contaminated, as if something had gotten beneath his skin that no legal verdict could fully remove. Sleep abandoned him, weight fell off him, and the stress became so total that he sometimes genuinely feared for his physical heart. He had spent 60 years protecting his name, and now his name was doing the opposite, and there was nothing he could do but wait and try to survive the waiting. The landmark lawsuit against the BBC came in 2018, when Cliff won damages for the broadcaster's decision to air live footage of the raid, and the headlines finally carried a different tone. None of that restored what had been taken, though. The allegation would always exist online, searchable, permanent, attached to his name in a way that no court ruling could erase. Standing before members of the House of Lords, he asked himself aloud whether he would ever truly get over it. His answer was no, stated plainly, without performance, the way a person speaks when they have run through every other possible answer and arrived at the only honest one. Something shifted between Cliff and Britain after that. The country that had embraced him since Move It exploded out of speakers in 1958. The same country that knighted him in 1995 started to feel different, and he began spending longer stretches of time in Barbados, the island he now calls home. Cliff himself has described it in terms that sound less like a dream retirement and more like a quiet retreat from somewhere he no longer fully felt welcome, because distance is not the same thing as peace. The work itself deserves its moment because it was extraordinary by any measure. Move It was recorded in under half an hour in 1958, and that raw recording helped ignite British rock and roll at a moment when the country was still finding its musical voice. Cliff Richard and the Shadows became the defining sound of an era, and songs like Living Doll, The Young Ones, and Summer Holiday weren't simply chart successes. They were cultural events that filled concert halls and defined a generation's soundtrack. Then at the very height of that momentum in 1964, at 24 years old, Cliff became a born-again Christian, and his relationship with Christianity would define his public identity as much as any song ever did. At a moment when pop music was racing toward rebellion, Cliff went in the exact opposite direction. He began reconsidering his material, declining certain performances, and seriously entertaining the idea of walking away from music altogether to become a teacher or a missionary. People inside the music industry assumed he had ended his own career, but what he had actually done was decide, clearly and deliberately, who he intended to be, regardless of the consequences, and then keep going anyway. From the 1970s through the 1990s and beyond, Cliff reinvented himself again and again, with Devil Woman, We Don't Talk Anymore, Wired for Sound, Mistletoe and Wine, and Savior's Day, all finding audiences across completely different musical eras. 250 million records sold, and the title of the only artist in UK chart history to achieve a top 5 album in 8 consecutive decades belongs entirely to him. From the 1950s through to the 2020s, through rock and roll, new wave, Britpop, and the streaming age, still charting, still standing. At 85, mid-tour on a show called Can't Stop Me Now, Cliff watches what he eats, plays tennis, and maintains the discipline that has driven his entire adult life. But the language has changed when he talks about performing. Rehearsals take more out of him. Recovery after shows costs more energy. And in a recent interview, he said plainly that many radio stations no longer play his music. "They don't play me because I'm old," his words were, delivered without anger, with the flat accuracy of someone who has stopped expecting the world to behave differently. And then came something quieter that cut through everything. Asked about the future, his reply landed simply, "I might be dead next year, so I don't even think about it anymore." Not dramatic, not performing for effect, just the honest reckoning of a man who understands that time is no longer something he can outrun. The loneliness is real, and he makes no effort to pretend otherwise. Gloria Hunniford and Paul Gambaccini are among the loyal friends who care for him genuinely, but they return home to families, to shared routines, to someone beside them at the end of a long day, and Cliff returns to quiet houses. His closest companion now is John McKeelan, a former Catholic missionary who helps manage his properties in Barbados and Portugal. Even within that friendship, Cliff has said plainly, "I don't like living alone, even now." So he leaves the lights on, not as a metaphor, but simply as a practical way of making silence feel slightly less absolute. What makes Cliff Richard's story settle so heavily is not the fame, not the scandal, not the statistics. The weight comes from the gap between what the world was given and what was actually happening underneath. The discipline read as effortlessness, the solitude read as a comfortable choice, the grief read as composure. For 65 years, a man showed up, performed, smiled, and kept moving, while something quieter and more complicated endured alongside all of it. He once put it this way, "You can't regret something you never had." A pause always follows that sentence, small and telling, as if he is still deciding whether he completely believes it. Cliff Richard built something extraordinary, and the only question that remains is exactly what it cost him to do it.